So a brief respite from our morphology and study of linguistics to a story that is astonishing. In human history, it is unique. As you know, once the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, the Jews were scattered. That scattering became known as the diaspora. Part of that was that the Jews, though they never had a land, lost their temple, for the next 1800 to 1900 years, they wandered. Much like the wandering in the desert, except they were parts of areas, hunted in those areas. But they had no land of their own. Neither did they have a language. Now, post-World War II, post-1948, since the formation of Israel as a state, we know Hebrew. Classes in Hebrew are strong. But for a long period of time, the only people who spoke Hebrew were the scholars and the rabbis. This is the story of the rebirth of a language. Never in human history has a spoken tongue, after a millennia plus, this case almost 2 millennia, come back. And it's all accounted for Eleazar ben Yehuda. Eleazar ben Yehuda is celebrated every year on January 19th. It's called Hebrew Language Day in Israel. And I was blessed to be there when they were celebrating it, and I was blessed to hear the story. He was born 1858, and he was born in Lithuania, a brilliant mind. And he was trained in the Talmudic academies, of course, around the world to keep the Hebrew people fed, to keep the Hebrew people spiritually intact. They would have these Talmudic academies called yeshivas, where they would train rabbis. All through the Middle Ages, all through the days of Enlightenment, Hebrew remained a philosophy, it remained a religion. But it was hard, number one, because you didn't have a temple. So you had to reestablish, how do we get covered for our sins or cleansed for our sins without having a temple, without having a place for the sacrifices. But secondly, the language as a spoken tongue died out. It was a written tongue. It was written, and it was the Babylonian Talmud, which I own, is one of the things you can buy. I mean, it was still taught, but really only the scholars, only the rich people, and only the rabbis could speak it. By the time Eleazar was growing up, he became convinced that Hebrew needed to be the language of the people, the lingua franca, the language of the commoners, spoken in the home. He decided, after a long period of time of study, he goes to France. He was going to study to be a doctor, but he got tuberculosis. But he was passionate about the Hebrew language. And he was, of course, a brilliant linguist, so he could speak it himself. He convinces his wife, Deborah, that we are going to raise our child, Itmar Ben Avi, who was born in 1882, after they got to what was then called Palestine. He convinced his wife, we're going to raise our son only speaking Hebrew in the home. And that was one of his 3 passions. October, I'm going to make sure I get the date right, October 13th, 1881. He decides, along with his friends, to only speak Hebrew among the Jews, among him and his Jewish friends. It's said that he did this on the Boulevard Montmartre in Paris, but by the time he moves to Palestine, he begins to only speak Hebrew to the Jewish shopkeepers, to the Jewish bakers, in the Jewish restaurants, and in so doing, he sparks a movement. He believes that the way you rebirth a language is you do so in 3 places: Hebrew in the home, Hebrew in the school, words, words, words. Those were his 3, as you see in the notes, those were his 3 passions. Hebrew in the home, I've told you, he taught his son. For the first time in 1,811 years, there was a person trained only in Hebrew, to only speak Hebrew. And that was his son. His son was the first person, 1,811 years after the fall in 70 AD. Hebrew in the schools. He starts academies. He's convinced not only in Palestine, but literally in every city that you could go, that there should be a Hebrew academy teaching the students, the children, to speak Hebrew. The way he does it for the adults is he starts a paper, Haratzin, and he starts this paper to educate the adults. But the big stumbling block is the vocabulary. To bring Hebrew into the modern context for bakery, croissant, street, any kind of word, the biblical Hebrew has only got about 8,000 words. He comes up with about another 500, but then through the academies, they start a language council and they start using philology to establish certain words, and they've added around now 15,000 words. He actually, before he dies in 1921, he actually writes a 17-volume history of ancient, biblical, and modern Hebrew. Through the sheer force, I mean, he couldn't do it just by himself, but through the sheer force of will of one man, the Hebrew language is spoken by well over 11, 12 million people today. It is absolutely unique in human history. And you and I study Hebrew and try to translate to our people, large part due to the fact that there was one man who wanted that tongue spoken again. And when Israel becomes a state, 1948, by then they said virtually 90% of the Jews living could speak Hebrew, and did so in their homes, even if it included a little bit of Yiddish or mixtures. An incredible story.